When some African Americans take DNA tests today, many are surprised to discover Native American ancestry alongside their West African heritage. For decades, this genetic evidence puzzled researchers and genealogists alike. But the answer lies not in some alternative origin story, but in a largely forgotten chapter of American history: the extensive intermarriage between enslaved Africans and Native Americans throughout the colonial period and early United States. Understanding this genetic legacy requires examining both the historical record and what modern DNA science reveals about these unions and how they help us trace African Americans' true journey back to Africa. The historical context: when Africans and Native Americans met. When the first enslaved Africans arrived in North America in the early 1600s, they encountered Native American nations who had already developed their own systems of slavery based on war captives. According to historical records, Native Americans initially accepted that enemies captured in conflict could be enslaved, much as they did with prisoners taken in intertribal warfare. This common ground created unexpected opportunities for interaction beyond master-slave relationships. As the Atlantic slave trade accelerated and more Africans arrived at colonial ports like Charleston, Savannah, and New Orleans, enslaved Africans and Native Americans found themselves in proximity, sometimes working on the same plantations, in frontier settlements, and in border regions where colonial control was weaker. Many of these encounters led to relationships that transcended the brutal systems designed to keep them apart. By the late 1700s and into the 1800s, intermarriage between Africans and Native Americans had become common enough to leave a measurable genetic mark. In New Jersey, enslaved Africans were characterized as having a distinct phenotype, a unique physical appearance, specifically due to extensive intermarriage with Native Americans of the colony. Similar patterns emerged in other regions, particularly in frontier areas and among communities that existed outside strict plantation hierarchies. The documented trend of intermarriage between indigenous and African-descended individuals flourished primarily from the 1700s through the early 1800s. This was a critical period when colonial and early American racial categories were still being defined and enforced. During this time, some Native American nations gave sanctuary to runaway enslaved Africans. Others incorporated runaways into their societies, integrating them into their communities. These weren't merely temporary arrangements, they resulted in lasting unions and children who carried the genetic heritage of both populations. One notable example is Paul Cuffey, Jr., 1759–1817, whose father was the prominent African-American businessman Paul Cuffey, Sr., and whose mother was Wampanoag. Such documented cases represent thousands of undocumented unions that shaped the genetic landscape of early America. However, this era of intermarriage began to decline significantly after the 1830s. As urban African-American communities developed their own distinct cultures and traditions separate from native villages, and as colonial and American laws increasingly restricted unions between races, the frequency of these intermarriages diminished. The racial categories that America would enforce for the next 2 centuries were hardening. What the genetics tell us. Modern DNA science has revealed the genetic signature of this historical intermarriage in remarkable detail. When African Americans undergo DNA testing today, many discover that their genetic ancestry includes Native American lineages alongside their predominant West African heritage. This genetic finding is not random. It is a direct result of the historical reality of extensive intermarriage. Here's what the genetic evidence reveals. Mitochondrial DNA and maternal lineages. Mitochondrial DNA, inherited exclusively from mothers, shows that some African Americans carry maternal lineages originating from Native American populations. When a Native American woman had children with an African man, those children inherited their mother's mitochondrial DNA. This maternal lineage would pass to all subsequent generations through female descendants. Finding Native American mitochondrial DNA in African American populations is not evidence of a different origin story. It is evidence of ancestral women from native nations who had children with African men centuries ago. Y chromosome and paternal lineages. Similarly, Y chromosome DNA, inherited from fathers, sometimes shows African American men carrying African paternal lineages, which they inherited from African fathers. This is consistent with African men having children with Native American women. These children would inherit their father's Y chromosome and pass it to their sons. Autosomal DNA. Most importantly, autosomal DNA, the DNA we inherit from all our ancestors across all our chromosomes, shows the clearest picture. When African Americans have autosomal segments that match Native American populations, genetic researchers can determine when that admixture likely occurred based on the size of the DNA segments. Smaller segments indicate more distant ancestors, while larger segments indicate more recent ancestors. The size of Native American segments in many African American genomes points to admixture occurring roughly 200 to 300 years ago, precisely the time frame of the documented intermarriage era. Here's the critical genetic logic that traces the journey back to Africa. 1. The origin of African DNA. The predominant ancestry in African Americans is West African. This DNA didn't appear spontaneously. It came from ancestors who originated in West Africa, in regions like modern-day Nigeria, Ghana, Cameroon, and Senegal. Genetic testing consistently identifies these specific West African populations as the source, not some alternative origin. 2. The Native American addition. The Native American DNA in many African American genomes represents intermarriage with indigenous populations who had lived in North America for thousands of years before any Europeans arrived. This Native American DNA is clearly distinguishable from West African DNA because these populations diverged genetically tens of thousands of years ago. 3. The timing confirms the transatlantic slave trade. The genetic admixture between African and Native American populations occurred at a specific time, the 1700s and early 1800s. This timing perfectly matches the historical period when enslaved Africans were being brought to North America in large numbers. It was during these centuries, and only these centuries, when sufficient numbers of both populations were present in the same geographic areas to allow for extensive intermarriage. 4. The geographic distribution matches historical records. The regions where the highest rates of African Native American intermarriage are found genetically correspond exactly to historical records. The frontier regions, areas with weaker colonial control, regions where runaway slaves could find refuge with native nations, and places like New Jersey where documented intermarriage left visible phenotypic markers. 5. Alternative explanations. Fail. If African Americans' West African ancestry came from somewhere other than the transatlantic slave trade, the genetic evidence would be different. We would expect to see different African populations represented, not concentrated from West Africa. We would expect different timing, not concentrated in the 1600s, 1800s. We would expect different geographic patterns. Instead, every piece of genetic evidence aligns perfectly with historical records of the slave trade. Tracing the journey from West Africa to North America, the genetic evidence, combined with historical documentation, allows us to trace a clear ancestral journey. West African origins. African Americans' primary ancestry originates in West African populations, specific ethnic groups, specific regions, specific genetic markers that scientists can now identify and trace. Capture and transport. During the 1600s, 1800s, Millions of people from these West African populations were captured in warfare or raids, transported to coastal slave trading posts, and forcibly loaded onto European ships. Arrival in North America. These enslaved Africans arrived at ports throughout colonial North America: Charleston, Savannah, New Orleans, Hampton, and others. Detailed ship manifests and port records document these arrivals. Intermarriage with native nations. Once in North America, some of these Africans, and particularly their descendants, formed relationships and intermarried with Native American populations, creating mixed ancestry children who inherited DNA from both continents. Genetic legacy. The DNA carried by modern African Americans reflects this entire journey. West African ancestry from the original African population, Native American ancestry from the indigenous people they encountered, and the specific timing and geographic patterns that match this historical narrative perfectly. The Native American ancestry found in many African American families is not evidence of a different origin story. Rather, it is genetic proof of a specific historical reality. Extensive intermarriage between enslaved Africans and Native Americans during a particular era. This admixture, far from contradicting the transatlantic slave trade, actually confirms it. The genetic journey leads clearly back to West Africa, to the specific populations at the specific time, through the documented historical mechanisms of the Atlantic slave trade. Every strand of DNA tells the same story, one of displacement, forced migration, resilience, and the creation of new communities from tragic circumstances. The science is clear, the history is documented, and the journey, though painful, is traceable in the very genes that African Americans carry today.